She weighed maybe 40 pounds. Her people had left her in the rubble, alive, and walked away. No argument. No backward glance. Just gone. And Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, a man who had been told his entire career that the Valthari were the enemy, knelt down in the ash, pressed his hand against her wound, and made a decision that would eventually change two civilizations. This is that story. Before we get into it, there are three things you're going to learn today. First, why the Valthari abandoned their own children as a cultural practice, and why it meant something completely different than what humans assumed. Second, what Marcus actually risked by saving her, and I mean legally, militarily, and physically. Because this wasn't a small act of kindness. This was an act that could have ended with him in a military prison. And third, what the little girl, who Marcus would eventually call Sable, did 23 years later. And why every single human on Earth owes her something. Strap in. This one's long. This one earns it. To understand why Marcus did what he did, you need to understand the world he was standing in. It was 2021, 11 years into what everyone officially called the Valthari Contact War, and what everyone unofficially called the mess. The Valthari hadn't come here to conquer us. That's the part history books sometimes leave out. They came because their home system was dying. A slow, stellar expansion, their sun going orange giant ahead of schedule, had given them roughly 140 years before their planet became uninhabitable. So they sent colony ships, dozens of them, and 3 of those ships ended up pointing at the same star we call home. Earth's governments made a choice. Not a proud one. They chose to fight. Now you might be wondering why. Why not negotiate? Why not share? And the honest answer is complicated. The Valthari don't communicate the way we do. They're not telepathic. They're not hive-minded. But their social structure is built around a concept that humans don't really have a clean word for. The closest translation is the settled truth. The idea that a thing spoken by an elder is not a suggestion, it is reality. You don't negotiate a settled truth. You receive it. Our diplomats sat across the table from Valthari elders and heard things like, "This planet will sustain 200 million of our people. We will begin settlement in the 3rd season." Not, "We'd like to discuss settlement." Not, "What do you think?" Just, "This is what will happen." And humanity, being humanity, heard that as a declaration of war. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. By 2021, nobody was asking that question anymore. They were just trying to survive the answer. Here's what makes Marcus Webb different from almost every other soldier in that war. He actually read the field xenocultural briefings. Most soldiers got those briefings. Thick packets of dry academic language about Valthari social structure, biological quirks, communication norms. Most soldiers use them as packing material. Marcus read every single one. Not because he was an academic. Not because he was soft. Because he grew up in a house where his grandmother always said, "Before you decide someone is your enemy, at least learn their name." He was a combat medic first, infantry second. He'd served in the Kepler 22 corridor, the Sigma Draconis skirmishes, and 2 tours on occupied Valthari colony vessels. He had seen Valthari fighters in combat. He had seen what their plasma lances did to human infantry. He carried scars on his left shoulder that proved it. He wasn't naive. He wasn't idealistic. He was just thorough. And on the morning of the 14th of March, 2021, thorough is what saved a child's life. Callister Station was a joint mining platform built on a moon called Eramus, orbiting a gas giant in the Tau Ceti system. Before the war, humans and Valthari had actually worked that platform together for about 8 months, back in 2028. One of the only sustained cooperative operations in the entire Contact War era. It didn't last, obviously. By 2219, Callister Station was a ruin. 2 battles had been fought over it. Human forces held the upper decks. Valthari forces had taken and re-lost the lower refinery sections. And the middle, the residential and logistics decks, was no man's land. Marcus's unit, Bravo Company, 9th Expeditionary, had been given a clearance and secure order that morning. Go through the middle decks. Mark civilian areas for extraction. Look for survivors, human survivors, it was implied. And report anything else. Anything else was the military's polite way of saying. Deal with whatever you find. They moved in fire teams of 4. Marcus's team was him, a young rifleman named Corporal Desta Haynes, a demolition specialist named Torres, and their team lead, Sergeant Okafor. They had been moving through the ruins for about 40 minutes when Torres radioed that he'd found something. His voice was flat, the kind of flat that means complicated. The corridor was partially collapsed, ceiling beams down, emergency lighting flickering amber through the smoke. And in the corner, half hidden under a fallen support strut, was a Valthari child. Now I need to stop here and describe what Valthari children look like, because it matters enormously to what happens next. Adult Valthari are imposing. They stand between 6 and 7 feet tall. Their skin is a deep gray blue, almost iridescent under direct light. They have 4 upper limbs, 2 primary arms, and 2 secondary limbs that function somewhere between arms and sensory organs. Their facial structure is elongated, with wide-set silver eyes and a mouth that splits in 3 directions when they speak. In combat, they look terrifying. In propaganda, they look monstrous. That was very much intentional on the part of Earth's media infrastructure. But this child looked nothing like that. She was maybe 6 years old in Valthari developmental terms, which Marcus would later learn is roughly equivalent to 4 in human terms. She was tiny, thin-limbed. Her secondary arms hadn't fully developed yet. They were more like little nubs at her shoulders, barely visible. Her skin was pale, almost white, because Valthari children don't develop their full pigmentation until adolescence. And her silver eyes were huge, disproportionate to her small face. She was looking up at Marcus with an expression that he would describe in his official report as visibly distressed but non-threatening. In his personal journal, he described it differently. He said she looked like she was waiting to be told whether or not she was allowed to keep breathing. Sergeant Okafor looked at the child and said 4 words. Not our problem. Move. Marcus didn't move. Desta looked between them. Torres looked at the wall. Nobody wanted to have this conversation. Sarge, Marcus said. She's wounded. Shrapnel, I think. Right flank, she's losing blood. Or whatever they lose. If we leave her, she's dead in 4 hours. She's Valthari, Webb. She's a child. She's the enemy's child. And here is where Marcus said the thing that would follow him for the rest of his career. He said, quietly, not aggressively, he said, I'm a medic. I don't get to have enemies under 40 pounds. Okafor ordered him to move, twice. Marcus stayed on his knees. I want to be clear about what Marcus was doing here. This was not a safe act of kindness. This was not a feel-good moment. Under the Unified Military Code for Extraterrestrial Engagement, Medical resources were prohibited from being expended on Valthari combatants without command authorization. And a child of a combatant species was legally ambiguous at best. Marcus knew this. He knew that Okafor could charge him. He knew that command could strip his rank. He knew, and this is the part that gets me every time, he knew there was a real possibility that the Valthari unit that had been in this sector would come back. And if they found him treating one of their children, that was unlikely to be a peaceful encounter. He stayed on his knees. He opened his med kit. He assessed the wound, a piece of hull shrapnel about 3 centimeters long, lodged just below the equivalent of her rib cage. The entry was clean. The concern was infection and blood pressure. Her blood was a dark copper color and thicker than human blood. He'd read about that in the xenobiology briefings. He knew specifically that Valthari clotting factors respond to human fibrin sealant because they had studied human biochemistry extensively during the diplomatic years. He had fibrin sealant in his kit. He used it. Okafor watched for 45 seconds. Then he posted Torres at the end of the corridor, told Desta to cover the upper entrance, and said nothing else. Which, if you know military culture, was his way of saying, "You've got 10 minutes. Be fast. Don't get us killed." Marcus was fast. The wound was sealed in 6 minutes. He wrapped her in a thermal sheet, designed for human body heat, but Valthari run warm, so it worked. And then he did something that even he couldn't fully explain afterward. He picked her up, and he carried her. Getting the child back to their evac point was the easy part. The hard part started when they got there. The company's medical officer, Captain Reyes, took one look at the situation and immediately called it above her pay grade. She treated the child. She wasn't going to let a kid die. But she also filed a mandatory incident report the moment she had signal. That report went up the chain in about 6 hours. By the time Marcus's unit had rotated back to the forward operating base on Aramis, there was a Judge Advocate General officer waiting for him. His name was Major Aldrich. He was not warm. He was not impressed. He sat Marcus down and read him the relevant sections of the UMCEE, the Unified Military Code for Extraterrestrial Engagement, and explained very precisely that Marcus had violated regulations regarding resource allocation, command authority, and most importantly, a classified policy called Directive 7 Alpha, which prohibited any action that could be interpreted as establishing a humanitarian precedent with Valthari forces. Read that last one again. Directive 7 Alpha. No humanitarian precedents. The reasoning was cold, but internally consistent. If human forces began treating Valthari wounded, even children, the Valthari might begin using that as a tactical advantage. Faking wounded, using children as scouts. The whole ugly calculus of asymmetric warfare applied to an alien species. Marcus listened to all of it. Then he said, "Is she alive?" Aldrich said, "Yes." Marcus said, "Then I'd do it again." The thing is, the JAG officer didn't actually charge him, not formally. And here's why, and this is a detail that most accounts leave out. While Marcus was being briefed on his potential violations, the child regained consciousness. And she spoke. Valthari language is extraordinarily complex. It's tonal, it's partially subsonic, and it has grammatical structures that human linguists are still arguing about today. A human who has not studied it cannot even hear some of the frequencies. But children's speech is simpler, slower. And the specific phrase she said, which a Valthari language specialist on base translated within the hour, was this. He pressed his hands over the open place. He did not let me empty out. "I am not afraid of him." That phrase, that single child's testimony, somehow ended up in the hands of Admiral Chen, commander of the Tau Ceti Expeditionary Fleet. Specifically because Admiral Chen's intelligence officer had been arguing for 6 months that there was a potential diplomatic window with Velthari civilian factions that command had been ignoring. Admiral Chen read that translation. She sat with it for a long moment. And then she did something no one expected. She personally intervened in Marcus's case. No charges filed. Incident sealed. Marcus given a commendation, quietly, for exemplary field judgment. The JAG officer who had been about to charge him told a colleague, off the record, "I have never had an admiral personally call me about a corporal, ever, in 20 years. Marcus didn't know any of this was happening. He was in a barracks room on Aramis, reading to the child from a tablet, a simple illustrated story he'd found in the station's education archive, originally designed to help human kids learn basic Tau Ceti system geography. He'd pointed at pictures, said the human words. She'd listened with enormous silver eyes, and slowly, carefully pointed back and made sounds. The translation team would later tell him that in those 3 days, the child had essentially begun building a bridge between her language and his. Not because anyone told her to, just because he'd talked to her like she was worth talking to. The war ended in 2231, not with a decisive military victory for either side. It ended because both civilizations were exhausted, because the economic cost was staggering, because a generation of young humans and young Velthari had grown up knowing nothing but this conflict and were beginning to ask why. The armistice of Kepler's station was signed on June 3rd, 2023. A power-sharing agreement for 6 contested systems, provisional joint settlements, restricted zones, a slow, painful, bureaucratic peace. Most people think the armistice was the end point. It wasn't. It was the beginning of the hard part. Because peace between species, actual peace, the kind where you're not just waiting for the next escalation, requires something that treaties can't provide. It requires trust. And trust requires someone who's lived on both sides of the line. Her name, in Velthari, was a tonal phrase that roughly translated to the small one who is not lost. Marcus had called her Sable in those early days, for her pale coloring, ironically. And the name stuck. She chose to keep it as her official human interface designation. After the armistice, Sable did something unprecedented. She formally petitioned the Velthari High Council, the body of elders who held the settled truth, to be recognized as a diplomatic emissary to human space. This was almost unheard of. Velthari elders don't typically send young people to do diplomatic work. That's considered an insult, implying the matter is too minor for a true elder. But Sable didn't go as a representative of youth. She went with testimony. She stood before the Human Velthari Joint Reconciliation Council, a body that had existed for 3 years and accomplished approximately nothing. And she told her story. Not a political speech, not a list of demands, a story. She described the corridor, the amber emergency lighting, the smoke, the sound of a human man kneeling down in the ash and pressing his hands over a wound when everything he'd been trained to believe told him not to. She said it in both languages, alternating sentences. And she said this: I spent 23 years trying to understand what Marcus Webb was. He was not following orders. He was not making a calculated peace offering. He was just unable to walk past. I have studied your species extensively since then. I believe this is one of the things that defines you. The inability to walk past. You call it many things: compassion, duty, stubbornness. We have a word for it in our language too. It is a very old word. It predates our wars and your wars. It means the one who stays when the others leave. I am asking this council. I am asking you to be the ones who stay. The chamber was quiet for a long time after that. The reconciliation talks that had been stalled for 3 years moved to active negotiation within 6 weeks. Within 2 years, the first joint settlement was established. Within 5, children in that settlement, human and Valthari, attended the same schools. Marcus Webb was there for the groundbreaking ceremony. He was 61 years old, retired from the military, working as a field medic trainer in the Tau Ceti colonial program. He stood in the crowd, not on the stage. Sable found him afterward. She was taller than him now. All Valthari get tall. She had her full iridescent coloring, deep blue-gray, shifting in the sunlight. She had 4 fully developed limbs. She looked nothing like the pale, terrified child in the corridor. She put her hands on his shoulders, the Valthari gesture of acknowledgement between people of equal standing. And she said in perfect English, with only the faintest tonal accent, "You made me possible." And Marcus Webb, decorated veteran of 11 years of war, man who had told a JAG officer to go ahead and charge him, man who had read alien field briefings when everyone else was sleeping, didn't have anything to say to that. He just nodded. And I think that was exactly the right response. There's a concept in Valthari culture, post-armistice scholars study it a lot, called the first thread. The idea is that a piece, no matter how large, always traces back to one single moment. One single thread pulled by one person who did not have to pull it. Marcus Webb pulled a thread in a burning corridor on a moon nobody cared about, in a system nobody was watching. He didn't save the galaxy that day. He just saved a kid. The galaxy caught up later. If you want more stories like this, about the moments when one person changed everything, check out the last video. It's linked right there. Because I promise you, this isn't the only time it happened. We'll see you next time.